Of course, as we know the story here, these, where does it say here? These two others of his disciples who were gathered with the named ones around the Lake of Galilee. Of course, we know that one of those two was not named Paul, or Saul, as he had been earlier known as. In fact, at this point, Saul's passions are already, I'm sure, stirred up. Saul's passions run deep. He would later say that he was a Pharisee amongst Pharisees, a Hebrew amongst Hebrews. His passions to defend the faith of Israel were deep, entrenched, and he was on the road to Damascus. Not to try to talk the Christians out of what they had come to believe. There's no indication in the text that he's about to go to Damascus to have a dialogue. He's going to Damascus to destroy the Christian presence that was beginning to take shape in Damascus. He was known as Saul. Soon and more renowned, he would be known as Paul, the apostle. And in the conversation that's revealed to us out of that chapter of Acts, it is a conversation that the Lord has with one named Ananias, telling him to go and look for that man from Tarsus named Saul and invite him into your presence. Now, Ananias' passions run wild too. He knows already what Saul represents, not only to that kernel of a Christian community in Damascus, but Ananias is well aware that Paul has good standing amongst the Hebrews. And if Paul were coming to Damascus, then he certainly would not stop there in trying to end this controversy that had arisen within the faith of Israel. Paul was a very passionate person, but sometimes passions have this way of blinding us to the truth. And it takes a moment of sheer divine intervention to deflate a little bit of that passion that Saul was carrying with him to Damascus. On the road, he is encountered himself by the risen Lord. And without any argument, one would expect, you see, that the passion that Saul has in his mind and in his heart to destroy that Christian community, one would at least have expected some kind of dialogue between Paul, Saul, and Jesus, perhaps protesting, perhaps who knows what. But there is something about that presence of the Lord that literally in a moment changes his passion from being the persecutor of the church to its greatest defender. And Ananias, of course, he's at first suspect. This is the one you want me to invite into the house, Lord? This is the one we know has come to Damascus to arrest us and perhaps even do worse. It was that passion in Ananias, and it's that passion in Paul that the Lord himself corrals and turns into a mighty energy. As I said a moment ago, passion, we know, very passionate people. Well, sometimes passion blinds us to the truth. I think it's in part why, once again, these disciples in this story don't recognize Jesus at first. It seems that they've kind of gone back to business as usual. They've gone back to their original passions. Where do we find them? They're fishing by the sea. And then in almost a repeat of one of Jesus' earlier miracle stories, have you caught any fish, he says to them. They don't have the slightest idea who's talking to them. No, they say. And then that person tells them to take their nets and throw it into the sea once again. And of course, this time, out hauls this net filled with fish that was very difficult to haul in. It's that passion that we bring into this faith, that passion that the Lord continues to ignite in surprising ways, in ways that we don't expect the passions to be ignited. The Lord is not a squasher of passion. He is an invigorator of passion. But let's not forget that often passion can cause us to be blind to the truth, even when it's staring us in the face. They have the slightest idea who's talking to them here. Throw your nets in, bring out the haul, and then it says one of the disciples that clicked in his mind. And by the time they got to the shore, breakfast was already being served. Jesus had the fire going. Jesus had the bread ready. Jesus had the fish ready. He invites the disciples to add more fish to the fire. And then John's gospel ends that story simply by saying, and this was the third time that Jesus appeared to them. And then he disappeared once again. The passion of these disciples, a passion that had been so deflated on that Friday, a passion that lay dormant on that Saturday, a passion that once again began to stir up when the word first came to them that the tomb was empty, and none of them could really explain at that point except Mary Magdalene, and they chose not to believe what she had to say until the Lord himself appeared to them once again. And the passion, as tradition tells us, the passion that these disciples carried with them for the rest of their lives, from one end of the empire to another, proclaiming the news of a God who had sent his Son into the world, who had been crucified and yet raised from the dead to free us from all of our captivities in life. The passion that they carried with them took them to their own graves, to their own executions. Later on in this same chapter of John, Jesus has a dialogue with Peter and reminds Peter that one day he too will experience the same kind of death that Jesus had experienced on the cross. But it's the passion. And yes, passion can sometimes blind us to the truth. But it's that passion, that spirit that is given to us, that is meant to be fueled, that is meant simply to bubble over. It's that passion that gets other people to take a look at who we are. If we treat this faith with indifference, if we treat this faith with simply a sense of obligation, what message does that give to the world that Paul himself was about to enter, where one person after another believed in this God and believed in that God, and there was this religion and that religion? How is Paul going to make his case convincing? Well, truly through the word that he proclaimed. But the word that he proclaimed did not have this attitude of indifference behind it. It had its passion, its spirit, its energy. A person could listen to Paul and see Paul and look at what he was doing. A person like Ananias could say, wait a minute now. You want him to come into my house? It was the passion that Paul and the disciples carried with them for the rest of their lives that I think was one of the major ingredients in what brought the world to its knees before the Lord, crucified and raised from the dead. Now, there certainly were, and there always will be, detractors. And every town and village that Paul would later go to, some would accept what he had to say, some would run him out of town. But it was the passion that Paul bore with him. The sense that I truly believe this is the truth, and this will make a difference as it has made for me. That's what Paul showed to villagers and townspeoples and to cities and to the Christian community in Damascus that certainly would have been extremely skeptical at first to invite into their community this one who was coming to persecute the community, if it had not been for that intervention of the Lord Jesus on the road to Damascus. We run out of steam sometimes. Right? We all do that. We do that in our homes. We do that in our places of work. We do it within the church. We run out of steam. But the Lord never runs out of passion to give away. And the more we seek after that presence of the Lord in our lives, the more that passion begins to stir. And out of that passion comes our witness. And out of that witness, well, as Paul himself would experience, a change of life for himself. Was not uncustomary in those days. If a person really did go through some major life-changing experience, he or she was welcomed to change their name. So Saul becomes Paul. The transformation had taken place. The passion had been born, a new kind of passion. And so may it continually be born in his church, amongst us, through his Spirit. Christ is alive and breathing that passion within us. Take a deep breath, my brothers and sisters. Take a deep, deep breath.